Hello everyone, welcome to Military Affairs Discussion. Protesters occupy the streets of Cuba. Russia turns its back in betrayal, while China quietly takes over. Ladies and gentlemen, the island of revolutionary dreams is now nothing but a deep, silent night. When the last lights in Havana go out, that's when the flames of anger from millions of people ignite. Cuba in 2026 is not only facing the collapse of the national power grid, but is also standing on the threshold of a historic upheaval. From the clanging of pots and pans to the massive street protests defying all repression, a new and heroic chapter is being written by the very hands of people who have nothing left to lose. And questions are being raised. Why did a nation that had been resilient for 60 years collapse completely after just one executive order from Washington? Why did Moscow stand by and watch its closest allies struggle in the darkness? Was it that Russia truly ran out of resources, or was this a calculated betrayal? While Russia was fleeing, China quietly built a solar empire right in America's backyard. What are their ambitions? Behind the hotels and the dazzling resorts, behind the lights reserved for Western activists, are millions of families forced to choose between medicine and spoiled food. Will Cuba liberalize to survive, sink deeper into the quagmire and collapse, or witness a bloody purge within its own elite? All of these questions will be analyzed in this video. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Cuba, and there's no electricity here. For many long months, Cuba has been plunged into a deep and desolate darkness. However, right from within that pitch-black darkness, a massive wave of civil unrest is rising stronger than ever before. The outrage peaked after prolonged rolling blackouts and severe food shortages, culminating in explosive protests. Millions of people bravely took to the streets, defying the government's brutal crackdowns. Across the streets, scenes of looting are unfolding in utter chaos. Government buildings were relentlessly attacked, and security barriers were mercilessly smashed. The Communist Party office was destroyed by fire. The symbols that this regime had considered inviolable for the past 60 years are now being toppled by the very hands of the people. Millions cheered, shaking the communist stronghold and shouting, "Down with communism! Long live freedom!" Faced with the power of the people's will, the government is falling into a state of utter panic. Special forces wearing black helmets have flooded the streets of Havana. The internet is completely down, and military helicopters roar as they fly low over the treetops. However, this time, all efforts to suppress have become ineffective, because millions of people out there have nothing left to lose. This is the largest popular uprising in Cuba since Fidel Castro's 1959 revolution. This island has endured extreme darkness and hunger for many months. The national power grid has collapsed. For 4 consecutive months, not a single drop of imported oil arrived on the island. The highways became deserted, with no cars in sight because there was no more fuel. Millions of people are trapped in a vortex of darkness, poverty, and exhaustion. And right in the midst of that crushing hardship, a great civil uprising broke out, a flame that would completely change the course of history. The wall of fear that had loomed for so long was completely shattered. It all began with the loud banging of pots and pans, a familiar ritual for expressing outrage among the people of Latin America. Millions of innocent civilians, forced into hunger and deprived of their rights, boldly marched toward government buildings once seen as forbidden by the regime. Resistance against oppression is no longer a choice. It is now the only way to survive and protect human dignity. Cuba, a human rights organization, has recorded hundreds of organized uprisings on the island. People are determined to overthrow the oppressive, rotten system that has suppressed them for years. Facing this massive wave of civil unrest, the rulers are trembling in terror right inside their luxurious palaces. When they look out the window toward the horizon, they see the silhouettes of American warships. And down on the streets, they have to face the unstoppable fury of the people they've oppressed for so many years. The global support network that had artificially sustained this system has vanished into thin air. The endless aid from the Soviet Union is now a thing of the past. The supply of cheap oil from Venezuela, exchanged for political loyalty, was also abruptly cut off like a fatal blow. The Cuban people have now realized a bitter truth. This system has never been able to stand on its own feet, but has only survived by fattening a corrupt minority with foreign aid. The only thing they produce is misery, and the only thing they export is corruption. Now that exploitative order is completely collapsing. As they see their downfall approaching, the elite are putting on the greatest display of hypocrisy in history. To cling to their seat of power, they do not hesitate to beg the imperialist United States, whom they had cursed for many years. They beg Washington for a lifeline in trade. At the same time, they eye the assets of the Cubans, whom they themselves drove to Miami. Those are enormous assets built up by the very capitalist system itself. In the shadows behind closed doors, they are plotting a dark succession plan. Their aim is to install El Congreo, the head of security for the Cachu family, as the successor. Their goal is not to save the people. It is to once again lock this prison door even tighter from the inside, using foreign capital to refinance their own machinery of oppression. However, this desperate effort by the elite class is clashing fiercely with the Hamilton Act of the United States. The law has drawn an extremely clear boundary. No regime rescue operation is allowed to take place until all political prisoners are released and the Cachu dictatorship is completely eliminated. The regime's stalling and deception of the world has come to an end. Just 90 miles to the north, in Miami, is the brilliant success of the Cuban exiles. It's the strongest proof that the issue isn't the Cuban people, but the system oppressing them. The same people, the same intelligence and work ethic. Clearly, prosperity and success will be created as soon as those oppressive collective chains are broken. Now, on the streets of Havana, those chains are being broken forever. The island that was once covered by this darkness is now the stage for the victorious flame of a free people, rising from the ruins of the past. The legend of the revolution has ended. Now, it is the people themselves who are the masters of the stage. To understand the collapse of Cuba, you only need to look at a single number. The island's electricity production depends on diesel fuel and imported crude oil for up to 90% of its electricity production. That number is equivalent to 100,000 barrels of oil per day. For many years, this resource came from Venezuela, first from Hugo Chavez and then from Maduro. But in January 2026, the U.S. government took a decisive step. With Trump's actions targeting Venezuela, that flow of oil was completely cut off. Immediately after that, Trump set up a global embargo with a direct executive order, declaring that anyone who sold oil to Cuba would face punitive tariffs from the U.S. Cuba's other supplier, Mexico, immediately backed down. Not a single large oil tanker has docked at Cuba's ports since December 2025. The final blow came when the U.S. officially banned Cuba from buying oil from Russia, even though at least 2 oil tankers were already on their way to deliver fuel to the island. Thus, the last lifeline was cut off, causing a devastating disaster that had already been foreseen in Cuba. In mid-February, the 1945 analysis platform issued a warning, noting that the island's oil reserves would only last for 15 more days, and now that moment has arrived. When the power plants ran out of fuel, the national grid was paralyzed. The entire country was unplugged. Reports from CNN, right on the streets of Havana, revealed the full scale of this disaster. Tourism, the island's only real source of foreign currency, has also ground to a halt. From January to November 2025, Cuba only welcomed about 1.2 million visitors, a dramatic decline. Compared to the 4.8 million in 2018, these are the words of a Cuban shop owner. CNN says it's truly a cry over the collapse of an entire economy. Everything right now is extremely uncertain. He says there's no fuel. He doesn't know when there will be any or what they'll use to pay for it. Tourism is completely frozen. Moreover, the collapse doesn't just stop at tourism. Factories also have to shut down because of the energy crisis. Even jet fuel for airplanes is affected. There is no more jet fuel either. Major airlines like Air Canada and Air France have had to suspend their flights. When the power grid collapses, it's not just the lights that go out. Trust in the government also vanishes. The Cuban people have become too familiar with poverty and shortages for decades. A continuous power outage lasting more than 60 hours is a sign that people are reaching the limits of survival. That threshold has been crossed in some areas. Access to clean water is now limited to just a few hours a day because the pumps can't operate. Families are forced to make life or death choices between overpriced medicine on the black market and basic foods that are rotting because there's no electricity for preservation. And finally, what had to happen happened. The famous American protest ritual called cacerolazo has spilled onto the streets of Cuba, on an unprecedented scale. In many areas of the capital, people who have been gripped by fear for generations have now taken to the streets to challenge the government. This is not limited to Havana, but has spread to more than 150 protests across the country. People are shouting that the problem is not just about fuel, but about the system itself. So how did the government respond? Like any dictatorship, the government cut off the internet and all communication with the outside world. They sent police into the streets, and the arrests began. But this time, things were different. The patience of a society condemned to live in poverty, lulled by fairy tales of justice, had officially run out. Recent reports from Havana show that the situation is escalating seriously. Explosions and roaring filled the air. Low-flying helicopters roared over the streets. Journalist Marjorie Sachs. The Cacho reports that Black Beret special forces have blocked the streets, not allowing residents to stand in front of their homes. That is the panic of the regime. Many people fear that Cuba is turning into a Venezuela scenario. Version 2.0 state media claims these are just military exercises. But for the people who are languishing in the darkness, those armed helicopters are not exercises. They are a direct threat. The moment of crisis has exposed not only the weakness of the economy, but also the hypocrisy of ideology in the most blatant way. Amidst that chaos, there is an event that will etch the decay of this system into history. Right in the center of Havana, the lights of a hotel still shine brightly. In that hotel, there are left-wing activists from the comfortable cities of the West, coming to express solidarity with Cuba. They include people like Pablo Iglesias, Hassan Piker, and Cotting. This is the true nature of the dictatorship system. The elite and those who support the regime live in luxury, while the people suffer in darkness. But this hypocrisy is not just about indulgence. It has come at a cost, one paid with human lives. Amidst that suffocating atmosphere, an ironic event took place when the band Kneecap from Ireland held a concert in Havana, in support of the Cuban government and for humanitarian aid. However, the massive amount of electricity used to light up the stage and operate the high-powered equipment indirectly caused a tragedy. At a nearby hospital, the excessive electricity consumption caused severe fluctuations in the power grid, which completely disabled the hospital's backup power system. This is exactly what the crowds on the street are passionately rising up against. They are not just protesting because of the power outage. They are fighting against injustice in a system that operates in an extremely unreasonable way. So, right in the midst of this massive chaos, what is Russia, Cuba's close ally, doing? Russia did not send any powerful oil tanker fleets or massive cargo planes to save its last stronghold in the Caribbean. On the contrary, in the face of the fuel crisis sweeping the island, Moscow is actually trying to evacuate its citizens through hurried one-way flights. Russia and Northwind have started operating evacuation flights. What is truly shocking is the way the Kremlin is trying to justify this abandonment. Along with Russian propagandists, they appeared on state television and bluntly declared that we owe Cuba nothing. They gave the reason that Cuba did not provide enough support for Moscow in the war in Ukraine and did not officially recognize the territories that Russia is occupying. However, in front of the camera, Vladimir Putin is still playing his usual game. He loudly criticizes the actions of the US and promises to continue sending oil to Cuba. At the end of March 2026, a Russian oil tanker docked in Cuba with the permission of the US. But that amount of fuel was only enough for just a few days. In other words, this was just a symbolic gesture from Putin. So why couldn't Moscow actually do anything more? That's because the quagmire in Ukraine has drained all of Russia's military, economic, and logistical capabilities. To cover up this impotence, Moscow often brings up history, especially the famous Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1962, they tried to create the illusion that they could still force Washington to the negotiating table by threatening to escalate nuclear tensions. But let's pause for a moment to consider this irony. Today's Russia is no longer the Soviet Union of the past. In 1962, they deployed nuclear missiles to Cuba. They forced President Kennedy to negotiate and achieve their goal, bringing the world to the brink of nuclear war. But today, Putin faces even more difficulties. He struggles just to send a civilian plane to evacuate citizens because of a fuel shortage, let alone launch a missile. The latest report from the International Crisis Group has shown that this collapse is not limited to Cuba. It is actually a Putin syndrome. Under increasing pressure from the U.S., Russia's support is now limited to just a few air defense systems and registering shadow oil tanker fleets under its own jurisdiction. The most impressive statement in the report points out that, just like what we witnessed during the collapse of the Assad regime, in Syria, the Kremlin completely lacked the military and logistical capabilities needed to keep its allies. In the U.S., the situation is stable. The multipolar world order that Putin once heavily promoted, barely surviving, slowly dying on Havana's dark streets. While Russia fled the island in a panic, another superpower was quietly observing and gradually filling this huge geopolitical gap in the Caribbean. That is China. The Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson made an official statement. They firmly support Cuba in defending its sovereignty and national security. They also pledged to provide all possible support. Do you know where the difference lies? Beijing isn't just talking, they're acting. China has signed an agreement to build 92 solar power plants in Cuba by 2024. And the first plant quietly went into operation at the beginning of 2025. It's not just solar panels, but also electrical equipment, tons of relief rice and infrastructure projects that are being continuously promoted. Of course, China is not doing this out of pure goodwill. Beijing doesn't care about saving Cuba. They only care about filling the gap that Russia left behind and establishing a permanent foothold, one that can't be dislodged right in America's backyard. The harshest part of this scenario for Putin is not just being outmaneuvered by China, but the real problem lies in the emptiness of the VIX project, which Putin has been touting for years as his strongest weapon against the West. Remember that Cuba joined BGX as an associate member from the beginning of 2025. But now the bloc led by Russia can't save its own members from the darkness, just because of a single executive order from the United States. This is not simply a failure. It's a complete collapse of VIX's foundation in its effort to become a global alternative. And the bill is being sent straight to the Kremlin. The most painful reality after Cuba's current collapse is that its economy has always depended on an external sponsor throughout history. At first, it was the Soviet Union. Then it was Hugo Chávez's Venezuela. This artificial sponsorship system is essentially just a cover, hiding the structural decay that has plagued Cuba for decades. Now, there are no more sponsors. The actual numbers say it all. Cuba's economy has shrunk by 11% between 2020 and 2024. Electricity production dropped from 20.7 TWn in 2019 to just 15.3 TWn in 2020. So what will happen next? In reality, there are only three paths open ahead for this island. The first path is a transition that involves negotiation. The government admits the system collapsed and gradually liberalized the economy, creating space for private businesses while still trying to maintain political control. Signs of this appeared when the harsh tone of President Diaz-Canel suddenly softened. On February 6, he declared his willingness to discuss all issues with Washington without any preconditions. According to dissident sources, secret negotiations with the U.S. began in mid-March. The second path is a prolonged collapse and increasing pressure. The regime remains stubborn, refusing to open the economy and implementing harsher police measures. But this is unsustainable because loyalty is seriously eroding. Cuba's population fell from 11.1 million people. By 2024, it had dropped to 9.7 million people. We are talking about an exodus of 12% of the population. For an island nation, this is demographic suicide. The third path is a sudden collapse within the elite class. When resources are completely depleted, those at the top of the regime will start fighting each other for the last remaining crumbs. Long silent factions will quietly contact Washington or Beijing to find a way to survive. Trust disappears completely. History has taught us that being closed off rarely gets better over time. Instead, one morning, it will all collapse with a terrifying crash. And this is the most shocking truth. No matter which scenario happens, Russia is no longer a decisive player. Putin is no longer sitting at the table in this great Caribbean conflict. So in your opinion, can Cuba weather this storm, or is collapse inevitable? And is China's intervention in the Caribbean now truly a lifeline for the Cuban people? or just a new geopolitical trap to replace Russia's grip? If faced with a choice between stability and poverty and uncertain freedom as it is now, can the Cuban people create a miracle like the exile community did in Miami?